Up next on the GRIOT,
Let's all get into some good trouble.
Dr. Eleanor Seaton, Associate Professor at Arizona State University School of Social and Family Dynamics. This proud daughter of Chicago's South Side is a racial discrimination expert and most definitely an American. Welcome, Dr. Eleanor Seaton, all the way from Arizona. I want to thank you for being a griot.
I wouldn't necessarily think of myself as a griot, but I will take that and add it to my repertoire of skills.
I'm sure you're looking forward to the fall semester.
I always look forward to teaching new kids, exposing them to new ideas. So yes, I am looking forward to seeing new faces.
You and I, we go way back.
Yes,
you and
we
I,
do.
University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Maybe we won't give away the year that we crossed, but we should let people know, even though we were in different sororities, you're a Delta, I'm an SG Rho, that we crossed the same night. So that was fun.
Yeah, how amazing is that, and how serendipitous. But yeah, shout out to all of my Illini out there.
Fast forward 20 some odd years, and you are now an accomplished professor, researcher in the space of racial discrimination, specifically how youth see themselves within the construct of racism. Talk to me a little bit about that area of expertise, what sort of led you in that direction.
I'm the daughter of the South. My family originates in the Mississippi Delta. My parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents all grew up in Mississippi. My parents moved to Chicago in the mid-60s. And when you have Southern roots, you don't have to go far to find activists, people who advocated for equity in the Jim Crow South, essentially. And so I was raised in a household where we always talked about race. We always talked about racism. That would be probably the first key pivotal moment for me. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do after graduating. And I was thinking about getting a PhD in psychology. So I made an appointment to go talk to the professor. And I told him about my burgeoning interest in pursuing a PhD in psychology. And he proceeded to tell me that he didn't think I would make it through the psychology PhD program. And when I did get into graduate school, when it was time to think about my dissertation topic, I wanted to know, why did I discount obvious racism? I could have easily acquiesced to this man. So, he's a professor. If he thinks I can't do it, I probably can't do it. But something else spurred me to reject his advice. And here I am, my own professor with a PhD in psychology. So when I was thinking about my dissertation topic, I wanted to know what specifically propels Black youth to still thrive and survive even in the midst of racism, which is pervasive, prevalent, and all-encompassing. And so those were those initial breadcrumbs that led me to that dissertation topic, which then launched my research agenda.
Your portfolio slaps, so no one can take that away from you. Thank you for coming on and being a griot, because the whole point of this is to assign you the task of sharing a historical moment in American history or global history that's significant to you, and then help us understand, why is this historical moment you've selected significant, meaningful at this moment, at this point in time, when we're all freely discussing some issues that, quite frankly, we haven't faced head on for quite some time. So I am waiting. What is your historical moment?
So this was not an easy task. I have to say, it felt like a mini dissertation, even. Like, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do?
Did it feel like pledging, maybe?
No, because that's a totally different, God bless my big sisters. That's a totally different. So I am choosing the after effects of Bacon's Rebellion. And I want to be clear, I'm talking about the after effects of Bacon's Rebellion. So Nathaniel Bacon was a white indentured servant who had come to the colonies to work. Indentured servants were recruited from Europe They would arrive from European countries, work for a definitive period of time, and then when they were free, they may have been given a small plot of land or they could return to Europe. Now, after about 1619, the first Africans were brought to the British colonies in 1619. It's estimated that 20 or so who originated around Mozambique ended up in present-day Virginia. Now, colonial America was a very interesting place because at that time, Africans were treated like indentured servants. They worked for a period of time, they were free, and then they were free to do whatever. Many of them became prosperous. They also freely, and this is important, mated and mingled with indentured servants from Europe. So they married each other, they had kids. There were none of the taboos that would arise. So what happened with Bacon's rebellion? Now, Nathaniel Bacon was wrong. He led an attack on neighboring Native American communities in and around Jamestown. The governor at the time had signed various treaties with the Native American groups in and around Jamestown and sided with the Native American group. In protest, Nathaniel Bacon led a group of white indentured Europeans, freed Africans, and enslaved Africans to Jamestown and burned it to the ground. After which time, the governor of Virginia declared him a traitor. So eventually, this rebellion was quelled. Now, as a result, though, of this rebellion, the plantation landowners decided that they would never, ever tolerate another interclass revolution. And so they needed to design a system that would prevent whites from aligning with Africans. They also decided to transfer their labor use strictly from European indentured servants to enslaved Africans. So 1680 and beyond is when we start to see what's called the slave codes. Racism has now become institutionalized. So the slave codes effectively meant that poor whites, the indentured servants who worked their time were then poor, would never ever align with Africans again. Why I think is very, very important, by institutionalizing racism, plantation landowners prevented poor whites from focusing on the classism that was already evident in colonial America. And I would submit to you, 340 years later, it's still pretty successful.
I was not expecting that. And I know people who are listening and watching, they're going to Dr. Google right now.
Nathaniel Bacon, 1676. Yes.
But yeah, no, thank you. Because I do think that you bring up an important point, and one that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about repeatedly. He constantly talked about this manufactured rift or fissure, if you will, between poor communities, no matter what your race was. What can we take away from this moment in history, and what are some tangible actions we can take?
So let's start with the takeaways. The main takeaway is that at the time in colonial America, the landowners were successful at distracting poor whites. Now, I want to be clear, after the slave codes were implemented, the condition of poor whites did not improve. They were still locked out of the capital that the landowners took for granted. So it's been a successful distraction. What do we have? Culture wars, abortion, gay marriage, gun safety, etc. And so it's a distraction that worked in 1680 and it works, unfortunately, in 2020. That's the takeaway. You alluded to what Dr. King talked about. And as a Chicago girl, shout out to Chicago, the South Side, all of my Chicago people, we had an example of someone who might have created an interclass, multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. And that's Fred Hammond, the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. Fred had actually built that coalition. He brought middle-class whites, low-income whites, Blacks, and Latinos in Chicago to the table. Before he was assassinated, he was about to bring the Black gangs to the table. Now, in the 60s, the Black gangs in Chicago were very, very powerful. And so J. Edgar Hoover, this is from the FBI files, determined that Fred Hampton was a threat to the national security. I'm not going to go into everything that happened. That's another historical moment. But Fred Hammond was building the coalition that will be necessary if we ever want to see fundamental change in this country. And so the takeaway would be, think about how you have been distracted from focusing on issues that matter to you by protesting what we call culture wars. Think about how that distraction has hurt your bottom line. I'll give one more example before I get to the action tips. In this current moment, we are in the midst of a global pandemic, the coronavirus, COVID-19. COVID-19 doesn't care if you're a Black, white, male, female, gay, straight, Republican, Democrat, American, Korean, it does not care. This little tiny virus that we cannot see with our naked eye is only looking for a healthy host to destroy. But yet, in the midst of this global pandemic, instead of listening to our experts, we have people who are protesting the fact that they are being instructed to wear masks.
Let's say we are immersing ourselves in new information and trying to digest that, but everyday average person, what am I to do with this? Because it's a lot.
It's a lot. Well, my first action tip is pretty simple. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and watch your social distancing. Again, we are in the midst of a global pandemic. It is ravaging minority communities, my community, Black American, Native American, Latinx. Anything that you can do to stop or reduce the spread of COVID-19 is fundamentally anti-racist and pretty much humanistic. That's the first action step. The second would be to educate yourselves about racism. Now, I know you have podcast listeners, and hopefully their appetites are whet now. So educate yourself about racism. So we've got some homework to do. Regardless of your age, we have some homework to do right now where we need to educate ourselves about racism. And that's not just white individuals who need to be educated about racism. And the last thing I would say, donate to organizations who are doing the work of racial justice. There are several. Some of my favorites include the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, Color of Change. There are organizations who are committed full-time to racial justice. You can donate your money and even your time or efforts to those organizations who have been doing this work far longer than this conversation started.
Danny, I think the subtext of what you're also saying is you have a role to play, no matter who you are. It doesn't matter. You can be in the highest levels of government, or you can just be that person who's going to work every day diligently raising your family and trying to make a good life for yourself. But you still have a role to play.
Some of my favorite movies are the Star Wars franchise, well, some of the Star Wars franchise, and the Lord of the Rings franchise. And I finally figured out why I love those movies, especially maybe Lord of the Rings more so than Star Wars. They demonstrate that everyone has a role to play. So in Lord of the Rings, Frodo needed to get the ring to Mordor. Sam needed to get Frodo to Mordor, Legolas. So everyone had a part to play, but because everyone played their part, they destroyed evil. And I think if you have that mindset, there's no big or little parts, but everyone has a part to play, we can actually see fundamental change. You may not be in the street protesting. That's okay. What's your part to play? Maybe your part is donating money to these organizations. Maybe your part is teaching the next generation to be anti-racist, which may be just as important as being in the streets right now. So everyone has a part to play. And I would encourage your listeners and your viewers, find out what your part to play in this struggle is and play that to the fullest, because we need everyone. This is an all hands on deck moment. And we need everyone to get in the struggle to affect change.
What is sort of your perspective on, when you hear people bring up, Black on Black crime, there's this uptick in crime in major cities, specifically in communities of color, and that these communities need to focus on their problem.
Anyone who would say, well, you should focus on Black and Black crime, my retort would be, let's talk about how systemic racism is the genesis of that, and let's start there. We can walk, chew gum, and even listen to music at the same time. And if you think about the fact that systemic racism is the genesis of some of these problems, then if we're going to attack an issue, let's deal with the foundational issue, which would be systemic racism.
I think what always is missing from that debate regarding Black on Black crime is this notion that there's no community responsibility. There's no, we don't feel responsible for that. But what you're saying is we can't ignore the economics tied to that.
Well, what happened in Chicago? Well, we need to go back to the late 60s and the early 70s. Again, I said I'm a daughter of Mississippi. My family is the Great Migration. So many of my extended family members moved to Chicago to work those great blue-collar jobs. The steel mills, Campbell's Soup, Nabisco. A lot of my family members worked those jobs. They had solid middle-class lives because they earned middle-class salaries without being college educated. Well, in the late 60s, we start to see this shift where manufacturing jobs are now going overseas for cheaper labor. So all of these African Americans who moved to the North, and not just Chicago, we can think Detroit, Gary, Indiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, St. Louis, Missouri, just to name a few, those jobs started to disappear. And there's a sociologist by the name of William Julius Wilson. He was the first person to talk about that. When these jobs disappeared, these issues in the Black community became magnified. So you no longer have work in the city for people who are not college educated. Now, this may be a news flash for your viewers. Only 30% of the American population is college educated. So what else are the 70% supposed to do now that these manufacturing jobs have disappeared to China, Mexico, and Vietnam? So now we see a fracturing in our communities. So even the genesis of the violence, and not to say that we haven't always had violence, we have, but the exacerbation of it can be traced directly back to the breakdown of communities that were being sustained by these manufacturing jobs that then went overseas for cheaper wages or cheap labor or non-existent paid labor for the most part. So again, not to say that we should not deal with the issues in the Black community. We absolutely should. And that's not to say that there aren't people who are dealing with those issues, because there absolutely are. Because I'm a social scientist, I'm a data person. And frequently when people want to challenge the claims we make about racism, I'm like, well, show me the data that indicates racism doesn't exist and we can talk. That has never happened.
Wow, Dr. Eleanor Seaton, I'm always impressed with you. I always say when I'm around you, I learn a new word, my vocabulary expands. But thank you so much for all of this data-driven information that you're giving us, and also for your courageous work that you're doing in this space to immerse yourself in racism and the impacts of racism. That's not easy. That's a very, very difficult walk.
One of my favorite quotes is from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So let's all do our part to bend the arc towards justice. And I'm going to end with one of my heroes who's being laid to rest this week, and that's John Lewis. Let's all get into some good trouble, because trust me, change is waiting. So let's all go out there and get in some good trouble.
I thank you for being a griot and sharing with us your moment in history, why it's significant, and what we can do, everyday people can do to be anti-racist and to do your part. So thank you. Bye.